Night settles most easily when the world feels older than the moment you are in, when the weight of time stretches so far behind you that the present seems small and unimportant by comparison. In those hours when sleep approaches slowly, the mind becomes more willing to drift backward, to imagine eras that left no clear edges behind them, only impressions, like footprints softened by wind and water. It is in this quiet state that ancient stories feel less like tales and more like memories waiting too long before writing was used to record daily life, before names were fixed and dates mattered. Human experience was carried differently. It moved through rhythm and repetition, through images spoken aloud until they settled into the body like breath. These were not histories in the modern sense. They were remembrances shaped by feeling rather than fact. Memories preserved, not because they were precise, but because they were necessary. They answered something deeper than curiosity. They explained why the world felt the way it did. In the earliest cities of southern Mesopotamia, people lived among rivers that rose and fell with a patience that could feel almost intentional. The land itself seemed to remember things, holding traces of past waters in its soil, in the way the ground flattened and hardened after each inundation. To live there was to understand that stability was temporary, that what existed now had once been something else and would one day change again. This understanding did not need explanation, it was simply part of the air. The Sumerians did not see themselves as standing at the beginning of time. Their texts, sparse and fragmented as they are, suggest something quieter and more unsettling. They often spoke as if something had already happened, as if the world they inhabited was not new but inherited. The tone is subtle, almost apologetic at times, as though they were caretakers of something they did not fully comprehend. Their cities rose on ground that had been washed and reshaped many times before, and perhaps that knowledge lingered in ways that never became explicit. When these people told stories about origins, the language was rarely triumphant. Creation did not arrive cleanly or joyfully. It emerged from disorder, from waters receding. There is a sense, woven through the words, that order was restored rather than invented. That humanity did not arrive at the dawn of everything, but after a long night whose details were already fading. It is here, in this gentle uncertainty, that the central question begins to take shape, not as a challenge to history and not as a claim, but as a quiet invitation to listen more closely. What if the Sumerians remembered an ending they were never meant to explain? What if their myths were not attempts to describe events, but efforts to live with impressions left behind by something too large, too distant, to be fully understood? Imagine memory not as a clear picture, but as a pressure, a feeling that something once existed in a different state, a sense of before, without the ability to define what that before contained. In human experience, this kind of memory is not unusual. We carry emotional residues from childhood. Long after the details disappear, we remember loss without remembering the moment it occurred. In this way, ancient flood traditions take on a different character. Rather than dramatic accounts of destruction, they become expressions of transition. Water does not simply erase, it resits, it smooths sharp edges, redistributes what remains, and leaves behind a quieter world. In Sumerian stories, floods are rarely described with spectacle. They arrive, they pass, and afterward there is rebuilding, remembrance, and silence about what came before. This silence is important. It suggests not ignorance, but restraint. Some things may have felt inappropriate to describe directly, either because the language no longer existed, or because the listeners themselves were already too far removed. To speak too clearly of an ending might have disturbed the fragile sense of order that followed. So the memory was softened, wrapped in metaphor, carried forward as myth. The earliest tablets speak of kingship descending, not rising. Authority is said to come down from somewhere else, already formed. This detail is often noted but rarely lingered on. Yet it carries an implication that leadership, structure, and social order were inherited concepts, not invented by the first city dwellers, but received from an earlier pattern, one that may no longer have been visible. If that is so, then Sumerian civilization becomes less a beginning and more a continuation, a careful reconstruction of ways of living that had been interrupted. Their reverence for order, measurement, and ritual may reflect an awareness of how easily such things can be lost. Their attention to cycles, to seasons and returns. Stability is never guaranteed. Consider the tone of their most enduring stories. Even when speaking of powerful figures, the emphasis often falls on limits. Heroes fail. Decisions lead to unintended consequences. Knowledge carries weight rather than freedom. There is no suggestion that the past was perfect, but there is a persistent sense that it was different, fuller in some ways, and that its passing left a mark. This mark may have been felt most strongly in the landscape itself. Southern Mesopotamia was shaped by ancient waterways whose courses shifted over time, leaving behind dry channels and buried sediments. To farm there was to work atop layers of previous worlds. Each generation built upon the remains of the last, often unaware of how many times the process had already occurred. Living in such a place naturally encourages a certain humility. When your city can be covered by silt, when your fields depend on waters that may rise too high or not at all, certainty feels fragile. Perhaps this fragility encouraged the Sumerians to look backward, not for answers, but for reassurance that survival was possible, that others had endured change before them. Their myths do not dwell on the mechanics of catastrophe. They do not describe the moment the waters came with vivid detail. Instead, they focus on aftermath, on who remained, on what was carried forward. This suggests that what mattered most was not the event itself, but the act of continuation. The quiet determination to rebuild, to remember just enough to avoid repeating the same mistakes. While letting the rest fade in this light, the idea of an unspoken ending becomes less mysterious and more human. When something profound occurs beyond living memory, it does not vanish entirely. It leaves traces in behavior, in values, in stories that seem symbolic but feel emotionally precise. The Sumerians may have lived with such traces, shaping their way with time reflects this, rather than a straight line. Time appears layered, curse, and dense. The past is not left behind. It presses gently against the present, influencing decisions and rituals. Festivals reenact moments that may never have occurred in the way they are remembered. Yet the reenactment itself serves a purpose. It stabilizes identity in a world that has already proven. What is striking is the absence of urgency in these stories. There is no insistence that the past must be fully known, no demand to recover lost details. Instead, there is acceptance, a recognition that some knowledge arrives incomplete, and that this incompleteness does not diminish its value. If anything, it makes it safer to hold. As you rest with this idea, it becomes easier to imagine that the Sumerians were not guarding secrets, but tending memories that had already softened by the time they received them. Memories that no longer belong to any single place or moment, but to the human experience of living after an ending, of waking into a world that feels quieter than it once was. Even if no one can say why, this perspective invites a different way of listening to ancient texts. Rather than asking what they describe, we can ask what they feel like. Do they carry relief, caution, reverence, sorrow? Often they seem to carry all of these at once, a complexity that suggests long reflection rather than sudden invention. Perhaps the most telling aspect is how rarely these stories assert dominance over the past. There is no claim that the present is superior, no celebration of having survived. Survival is treated as a given, not an achievement. Life continues because it must, not because it triumphed. This tone feels consistent with people who understood continuity as fragile and endurance as quiet rather than heroic. As the night deepens, it is worth holding on to this image, a civilization not standing at the dawn of time, but living in the early light after something immense had already passed, carrying forward fragments of memory, shaped by care and restraint, speaking softly about origins, not because they knew nothing but because they sensed how much had already been lost. And in that softness, in that refusal to explain too clearly, there is an unexpected intimacy, a recognition that some endings are not meant to be understood, only lived. With that memory can exist without narrative, and meaning without certainty. The Sumerians may have known this intuitively, and built their world around it, stone by stone, story by story, leaving us with echoes rather than answers. The question, then, is not whether they remembered an ending, but how that remembrance shaped the way they chose to live afterward. And it is here in the space between memory and silence that the story continues slowly unfolding, like a river receding, revealing traces of what once lay beneath. As the river recedes, what it leaves behind is rarely obvious at first. The surface dries, cracks, hardens, and only later does the pattern beneath become visible. In much the same way, the traces of an ending remembered only indirectly would not announce themselves loudly. They would settle into habits, into assumptions about how the world works, into an unspoken agreement that certain questions are better approached sideways rather than directly. If the Sumerians lived with such an inheritance, it may explain their careful attention to balance. Their stories return again and again to the idea that excess invites correction, that when boundaries are crossed, the world responds. This is not framed as punishment, but as inevitability. The language does not accuse, it observes, as though the lesson had already been learned once, long before these words were shaped into tablets. There is a quiet maturity in this woe. It does not sound like the voice of a culture discovering danger for the first time. It sounds like remembrance, filtered through distance. Like advice passed down without the accompanying story of how it was earned. This is how things are, the myths seem to say, not because someone decreed it, but because experience, long ago, made it so. In their accounts of beginnings, the world does not burst into being, it settles. Forms emerge from waters, from mingled elements, from a state that is neither empty nor complete. This imagery carries a sense of aftermath rather than origin, creation as rearrangement, order as recovery. Such language feels natural if the people speaking it sense that something had already been undone. What is especially notable is the absence of nostalgia. The past is not described as a golden age to be restored. There is no longing to return. Instead, there is acceptance of the present as the only viable place to stand. Whatever ended fully enough that going back was neither possible nor desirable. What remained was the responsibility to continue attentively and modestly. This attitude may be reflected in how the Sumerians approached knowledge. Its stories is often portrayed as heavy, even dangerous. To know too much is to risk imbalance. To seek answers without restraint is to invite consequences. This caution suggests an awareness that knowledge can outpace understanding, that some truths arrive without the context needed to hold them safely. If memories of an ending lingered, they may have taught precisely this lesson, that seeing too clearly what once was could zealize what is, and so memory was softened, wrapped in symbol, distributed across generations in manageable fragments, enough to guide behavior, not enough to overwhelm. The flood in this sense becomes less an event and more a boundary. A line between ways of being. Before it, things were different in ways no longer accessible. After it, life resumed under altered conditions. The specifics dissolve, but the boundary remains. A sense that the world has already crossed a threshold once, and could do so again. This may explain why Sumerian time feels both cyclical and fragile. Cycles repeat, yes, but repetition does not guarantee safety. Each return carries uncertainty. The rivers may rise as they always have, but that does not mean they will rise gently. The past offers patterns, not promises. Living with this understanding would naturally foster a certain restraint in ambition. Cities were built, laws written, rituals performed, but always with an undercurrent of humility. Human systems were seen as temporary arrangements within a larger, less predictable order. To forget this would be to invite correction. Even their depictions of authority reflect this tone. Leaders are not immortalized as flawless founders. They are depicted as intermediaries, stewards rather than creators. When they fail, the consequences ripple outward, affecting land and people alike. Authority, like memory, is treated as a responsibility rather than a possession. If an ending lay behind all this, it need not have been remembered consciously. It could have been carried as intuition, a shared sense that the world had once exceeded its limits, and that survival required adjustment. Such intuitions do not require explanation, they are felt as common sense. This kind of inherited awareness can persist for astonishing lengths of time. Long after the original cause has faded, the behavior it shaped remains. People continue to act carefully around waters, to respect boundaries, to tell stories that warn without accusing. The origin of these habits becomes irrelevant. Their function remains. As centuries passed, the Sumerians themselves, records were copied, adapted, translated. New culture and inherited not only their techniques and symbols, but also their tone. The sense that the world is older than it appears, that something important has already been lost, and that what remains must be handled gently in this way. An unspoken ending could ripple forward indefinitely, shaping civilizations that no longer remember why they feel the way they do. The memory becomes diffuse, embedded in cultural atmosphere. It is felt as gravity rather than story. Listening to these ancient voices now, from a great distance we may be tempted to extract conclusions, to decide what really happened, but doing so may miss the more subtle truth they offer. That memory does not always arrive as information. Sometimes it arrives as mood, as a way of standing in the world. The Sumerians may have understood this better than we do. They did not insist on clarity where clarity was impossible. They allowed ambiguity to remain. They trusted that meaning could survive without precision. That trust is what gives their myths their enduring quality. They do not demand belief. They invite reflection. They do not close questions. They open spaces, and in those spaces listeners across millennia can find their own thoughts slowing. Settling into deeper time as sleep approaches, it becomes easier to imagine how such stories were once heard, spoken softly, repeated often, their rhythms smoothing the edges of wakefulness, not to instruct, but to reassure, not to warn of disaster, but to remind listeners that the world they inhabit has already endured change, and that life continues nonetheless. Perhaps this is the most important inheritance of all, not a record of an ending, but a demonstration of how to live afterward, with an acceptance that not everything can be known, and that this is not a failure. The Sumerians may have lived with the quiet knowledge that the ground beneath them had been shaped by forces beyond human scale, that their rivers carried histories deeper than any story, that their cities stood on layers of previous worlds, each one complete in its own time, each one gone rather than despairing. They built anyway, they sang, they measured the stars, they told stories that held just enough memory to orient them, and just enough silence to let the past rest. In doing so, they offer something rare, a model of remembrance without obsession, of continuity, without denial, of living in the present while acknowledging that it is not the first, and will not be the last. As the imagined river settles into its banks once more, the traces it leaves behind begin to fade, not erased, but absorbed. And somewhere within that absorption lies the answer the Sumerians never needed to explain: that endings can be survived, that memory can be carried quietly, and that the world, though altered, remains a place where life can unfold again slowly, attentively, under the long shadow of deep time. The shadow of deep time does not press down so much as it stretches outward, creating a horizon that feels both distant and present at once. To live beneath it is to sense that one's own moment is brief, but not insignificant. This balance between humility and persistence seems to pulse quietly beneath the surface of Sumerian thought, as though shaped by a past that had already demonstrated how fragile permanence can be. If an ending once occurred beyond their direct memory, it may have taught an unspoken lesson about adaptation, not adaptation in the sense of triumph, but in the sense of listening, watching the land, observing the water, learning where to build and where not to, accepting that some forces cannot be controlled, only anticipated and respected. Such lessons do not require dramatic retelling. They settle into practice. An identity once formed carries forward even when its original reasons are forgotten. In this way, the memory of an ending could persist without a story attached to it, living instead in choices made almost automatically: where to place a city, how to align a structure, when to gather, when to wait. The Sumerians' attention to order may reflect precisely this kind of inheritance. Order, not as rigidity, but as alignment with patterns larger than oneself. Their systems of measurement, their calendars, their rituals of timing, all suggest a desire to remain in harmony. In this sense was not aesthetic, it was protective. This protection extended into language itself. Words were chosen carefully, meanings layered. A single symbol could hold multiple interpretations, allowing understanding to shift gently rather than fracture. Such ambiguity can feel frustrating to modern readers, but it may have been intentional to remain flexible enough to survive. When something too definitive is written, it risks becoming obsolete. When meaning is allowed to breathe, it can adapt to new contexts without losing its core. Perhaps this is why Sumerian myths feel simultaneously specific and elusive. They point towards something but never trap it. Absence is acknowledged without dramatization. Cities fall, names disappear. Yet the tone remains, even as though loss itself had become familiar, not welcomed, but expected, integrated into the rhythm of existence rather than treated as an interruption. This familiarity may have fostered resilience. A culture that does not cling too tightly to any single form is better prepared for change. If the Sumerians inherited the residue of an ending, they may have learned indirectly that survival depends on letting go as much as holding on. The idea of letting go appears subtly in their views of legacy. What mattered was not individual immortality, but continuity to contribute to a pattern that would outlast any single life. This orientation shifts focus away from beginnings and endings, and toward the space between them, toward maintenance rather than conquest. In such a way, explaining the distant past becomes less important than behaving well in the present. Speculation gives way to stewardship. Memory serves not to glorify what was lost, but to remind people how easily it can be lost again. Listening to these ancient echoes now, it is tempting to search for parallels, to wonder whether modern humanity carries similar unspoken memories, shaped by experiences too large to articulate fully. Perhaps the Sumerian experience is not unique, but an early example of a pattern that repeats whenever civilizations inherit worlds, shaped by forces beyond their control. If so, their quiet approach offers guidance. Not through instruction but through example. They did not rush certainty to remain. They trusted that living attentively was more important than knowing precisely why. As the night continues and the mind drifts further from immediate concerns, this trust begins to feel comforting. It suggests that understanding is not always necessary for meaning to exist, that one can live wisely without having access to every answer, that memory can guide even when it remains incomplete. The Sumerians may have stood at the edge of such understanding, aware that their world was both gift and remainder. Something left behind but not abandoned, something shaped by loss but not defined by it. In that awareness, they found a way to live that was neither fearful nor naïve. Their stories do not demand that we solve them. They invite us to slow down, to feel the weight of time without needing to measure it, to recognize that our own moment too may be shaped by events we will never fully comprehend. And perhaps that is the quiet continuity that connects us to them, not through shared facts, but through shared experience. The experience of waking into a world already marked by change, of sensing that something has ended, even if we cannot name it, of choosing nonetheless to build, to remember gently, and to let some things remain unspoken. In the end, the question of whether the Sumerians remembered an ending they could not explain becomes less about them, and more about how memory itself moves through time. It moves not in straight lines, but in ripples. Not as clear images, but as textures of thought and feeling. As sleep finally approaches, these textures soften further. What remains is not a story with a beginning and an end, but a sense of continuity stretching quietly in both directions. A reminder that endings, even when unspoken, do not always mark disappearance. Sometimes they mark transition. Sometimes they mark the beginning of a quieter way of being in the world. And in that quiet, the past is not gone. It rests beneath the surface, like a riverbed waiting for the water to return, shaping the flow long after the current itself has passed. The riverbed does not ask to be seen. It does not announce its presence. Yet every movement of water is guided by its shape, by contours carved long before the current arrives. In much the same way, the past that is never spoken still directs the flow of thought, belief, and behavior. The Sumerians may have lived with this understanding, sensing that what mattered most was not what could be named, but what quietly endured beneath the surface. To imagine their world is to imagine a people attentive to subtle signals, the color of the soil after the waters withdrew, the silence that followed a season of excess, the way certain places felt older than others, heavier somehow as though they had already witnessed too much. Such impressions do not require explanation. They are felt, and feeling is often enough. In this attentiveness there is a kind of reverence that does not depend on certainty, reverence for forces that cannot be commanded, for the awareness that human presence is temporary, but participation is ongoing. One steps into a current already moving, already shaped. If the Sumerians remembered an ending they were never meant to explain, it may have been because explanation was not the point. The memory existed to orient them, not to satisfy curiosity. It reminded them that the world had changed before, and could change again, and that life continued not by resisting this truth, but by accommodating it. Accommodation does not mean resignation. it means adjustment. The careful placement of walls, the timing of planting, all of these are forms of wisdom that arise when one accepts that control is limited, but response is possible. Over generations, such wisdom becomes almost invisible. It is embedded in custom, in expectation, in what feels obvious. People no longer say, "We do this because something once ended." They simply do it because it works, because it feels right, because it aligns with the world as they experience it. This invisibility may be why the memory endured at all. What is constantly explained, risks being argued, dismissed, or forgotten. What is lived becomes resilient. The Sumerians may have lived their memory rather than narrated it, allowing it to pass quietly from one generation to the next without needing to be defended. As time moved on, new languages emerged, new powers rose, and the Sumerians themselves faded into the deeper layers of history. Yet the tone they established, later cultures inherited not just techniques and symbols, but an atmosphere of thought, a seriousness tempered by humility, a sense that the past was vast and not entirely recoverable. In this way, the unspoken ending continued to echo, even as its origin grew more distant. It became part of a larger human pattern, one that repeats whenever societies arise on land shaped by ancient forces, the recognition that one is never first, that the ground beneath one's feet has already carried other lives, other worlds. This recognition does not have to be heavy. In the Sumerian imagination, it seems to have been accepted with a certain calm. There is sadness, yes, but also steadiness. A willingness to inhabit the present fully, without demanding that it be eternal. As listeners now removed by thousands of years, we are not meant to resolve their questions, to allow the quiet uncertainty they carried to slow our own thinking, to soften our need for clear boundaries between beginning and end. When the mind relaxes into this slower rhythm, something shifts. Time feels less linear, moments overlap. The distance between then and now narrows, not because facts align, but because we too live in a world shaped by events we did not witness, guided by assumptions whose origins we rarely examine. Perhaps this is why the Sumerian voice still feels familiar. It speaks from a place of knowing without insisting, of remembering without claiming authority. It offers companionship rather than instruction, a reminder that uncertainty is not an obstacle to meaning, but one of its sources. As the imagined night deepens and the edges of thought begin to blur, it becomes easier to rest with the idea that not all endings need names. Some are carried forward as tone, as posture, as a way of inhabiting the world gently. The Sumerians may have sensed that their role was not to explain what had been lost, but to tend what remained, to build carefully, to speak softly, to remember just enough. In doing so, they created a civilization that did not shout its origins, but whispered its continuity. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson they leave behind. That memory does not always seek resolution. That history does not always demand clarity. That sometimes the deepest wisdom lies in knowing how to live after an ending, even when the ending itself has dissolved into silence. As sleep finally takes hold, these thoughts need not be held tightly. Like the river returning to its course, they can drift guided by shapes formed long ago. What remains is a sense of connection across time, a quiet acknowledgement that we too stand within a flow shaped by unseen depths. The past rests beneath us, not as a burden, but as a foundation. And in that resting, there is peace.